cursing is cool.
Yeah, totally fine.
That was a fucked up world. I don't know how else to put it anyway.
Welcome to What Haunts You, a podcast about the stories that haunt our dreams. I'm your host, Carly, and today I have my friend Kayla with me to talk about a book that we both kind of didn't like, but also kind of like talking about. So, do you want to introduce yourself and kind of tell people why this book is of interest to you and where they can find you?
Absolutely. So I am Kayla. The internet knows me as Oy Vey, it's Kay. I write about food systems. I've studied food systems. I've researched food systems, and I have been a vegan, still am a vegan for over 10 years at this point. I think coming up on 11-ish. And I like to think really deeply about food, and I like to hear other people talk about food. And so reading this book was an experience as somebody who I will also say is not into horror generally, but Carly knew that before I came on, so I'm guessing that's okay at this point. So I'm excited to get into it more, and also I did not eat before this because I can't think about this context of actually eating food.
Yeah, I think that's pretty understandable. And yeah, I think that one of my favorite things about horror is the conversation starter that it can be. And so, yeah, I think I'm like prepared for focusing more on the themes and focusing more on kind of what the book is doing and how we're reacting to it than actually getting into like the tropes and things like that, which I don't think apply quite as much to this book anyway. But we're going to be talking about the book Tender is the Flesh. And I should have the author's name in front of me, and I don't.
Augustina Bazterrica.
This book is a pretty rough one. I think this is a book that a lot of people are interested in, but that a lot of people probably don't want to read for reasons that I think are understandable. So I think our plan is to kind of walk through the plot a little bit and kind of get into the themes that come up. And then after we're kind of get to the end, we'll zoom out and just kind of talk about the world that the book is creating and the questions that it's, I think, posing to the readers. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
So in our book, the main character in the story, his name is Marcos. He's living during a time that is pretty fraught, I would say, even compared to our times, which are already pretty fraught. And he's living after what's called the transition, which is the time where the world shifted from eating animal meat to eating human meat. This happened due to a supposed virus that was infecting the animals of the world. And so he is working at a processing plant. His wife left him after his son died, and he is responsible for paying for his father's care in his like hospice care nursing home. So we have this man who's kind of down on his luck, but also like participating in this system.
He was raised in it too. His father was also in the pre-transition animal meat industry, so I think it's intergenerational for him, second generation at this point too.
I do think that's like significant to some of the choices that he makes.
It's also probably why his father had such a rough time with the transition. Was like he was in that world, and then his world was like taken away, or at least like version 2 of it came around, and it was too much, right?
Totally. We even have
Absolutely. Also, maybe to throw out some trigger warnings because this is a very graphic book.
passages carefully where I'm I'm representing accurately how horrible it is without having some of the more graphic scenes and descriptions that I think are just not totally necessary to people who are curious about the book and don't want to read it for those exact reasons.
Yeah, no, you did a good job. It's hard to vet these quotes at this point, so it's a lot of intention and care into that.
Yeah. So when the transition happened, the government basically stepped in and killed all of the animals, and like even then kind of had people killing their own pets. And we see Marcos reflecting on this, and he's thinking he'd had to slaughter them, knowing, suspecting that the virus was a lie invented by global powers and legitimized by the government and media. I'm never totally clear in the story to what extent the virus is real. I feel like I keep going back and forth about that, but ultimately, he is not convinced that his pets are a threat, and he goes through with this anyway.
Yeah, it seems like in a lot of it, we don't know also what the government is doing versus what the industry is doing, and that maybe the virus is like a made up way to get control and just like shift into this post purge world. It doesn't seem like he is a conspiracy theorist in the same way that like people are in real life questioning diseases that lead to global pandemics. There is a quote even later on about that you can't trust the government because all they want to do is control you.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting, and I think also how people reacted to the virus when it came to their companion animals in a different way than the wild animals that were out there or farmed animals is pretty interesting too, because he says that some people supposedly, right, because he doesn't fully believe it, died rather than have to kill their companion animals, you know. And I think that that says a lot about even the differentiation that we have in real life between animals we deem as like wild or like for farming versus animals that we keep in our homes. And I think domestication is a huge theme of this book. And it starts out by like introducing it through companion animals or pets.
Yeah, for sure. And I think in the book too, there's a lot of talk about the taboo of eating meat that they refer to it as meat with a first and last name,
Mm-hmm.
right? Meaning not meat made through these processing plants or like these quote unquote legit, like this is obviously not how I feel, but legitimate ways. And I think that reminds me too a lot of like domesticated animals and pets and how, right, our pets have, I think, first and last names. Like maybe, I think some people might debate about the last name part, but right, our pets are animals with names. And we do, I mean, I think not everyone, right? But I think like as a society, we do view them as somehow distinct from other animals, even animals that are just as like intelligent and aware as the pets that we have are.
Yeah, that's speciesism to a T, you know. And I think it is interesting too, though, that that idea of like the meat with a first and last name changes with class and status, because there is a type of like ultra wealthy, we hunt people for sport, that they want to pick like people of recognition, which seems more cruel, or we're made to think is more cruel than just random quote, not people from heads, right? They call them heads when they go to the plant, which is very similar to the industry in real life. And like there is a distinction between heads that are not known and heads of people who are recognizable, and like that there is more status to kill them. It's very much like game animals. We have all these distinctions in real life that also appear in the book, to imply the different kind of status to their killing, to the hunting, to the sport, that is very much like real life. So it's only unacceptable until you have enough money where it becomes cool. Not just acceptable, but like very cool.
Yeah. I think I'm realizing that this is totally a book that I would be curious to read, not a sequel to, but somebody in another city somewhere at the same time, and just like what are other people going through as this is happening. I mean, I think the first time I read this book, I kind of, as soon as I knew the premise, knew where it would start. And right, it always starts with marginalized people. It starts the way everything else does. There are two quotes that stand out to me as exemplifying the kind of exact way I would picture this to happen if it were to happen in reality. There's a quote that says, "The press documented a case of two unemployed Bolivians who had been attacked, dismembered, and barbecued by a group of neighbors." And then just following that, it says, and this is the part that I think stands out to me, is really kind of summing up the way marginalized folks are kind of treated and discarded. And it says, in some countries, immigrants began to disappear in large numbers. Immigrants, the marginalized, the poor, they were persecuted and eventually slaughtered. Legalization occurred when the governments gave in to pressure from a big money industry that had come to a halt. They adapted the processing plants and regulations. Not long after, they began to breed people as animals to supply the massive demand for meat.
It hits. It's there is no distance. Even in this, it's like supposed to be a dystopia, and yet that's like exactly what happens in our world. Maybe to not this degree, but the food industry was literally created with government and private industry hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of our regulations today are like what the government could get through with as much cooperation or as little resistance from the food and farming industries. And so to me, this is like not that hard to imagine that the industry goes, hey, we've stopped making money because of this crazy pandemic thing that is happening, and that's not okay. So we need to make it better. Our answer is to both deregulate and change the regulations in favor of us. And it's not about ethics. There's no what's best for people, it's what's best for the industry. And that's like especially poignant given the deregulation that we're seeing even in the news this week today, end of February, with what the Trump administration is doing in the meatpacking industry. And it's going to hurt workers and it's going to hurt public health. And it's just, it hits so close to home.
Yeah, it really does. And it hit close to home already the first time I read it, but I will say some of the recent government changes definitely make it even more hard to read and hard to sit with, but also like maybe more important. And we're going to stay mostly focused on the agricultural, like factory farm. We're going to stay on the food for most of this conversation, but I think in this moment I'm also kind of just realizing how much this makes me think of the prison system. Less about the breeding, but just that it's like these huge swaths of people just kind of disappear into the system, and it's always people who basically have no resources and no help, and that it's more rare for somebody to end up in a situation where they are subjected to that fate. And there are even people in this book who are subjected to that fate for committing crimes, but I think only the well-off people need to commit a crime for that to happen to them, or like a severe enough crime, I guess I would say.
Yeah, and I think too, not just the carceral system, but what fascism has looked like historically, which is truly the rounding up of the marginalized and the persecution, and then this government shift where they try to make what seems like the craziest thing that could happen in the world not crazy. You're crazy if you think it's crazy, or you're
Mhm.
crazy if you talk about it being crazy, which is
Mhm.
you're not supposed to talk about it in this dystopia. You're not allowed to say certain words. It's frowned upon, and it could end up in what they call, at least Marcos calls, like assassination. He could essentially be killed if he says the wrong word as somebody who's high up in one of these plants. And this also, like the agricultural industry is also always related to the carceral system because so much is criminalized when it comes to revealing truths or trying to bring transparency to the industry in real life. And that happens with whistleblowers, that happens with people who try to film, it happens with people who don't know they're not allowed to film near a farm and do and end up being arrested. It's just again, not too much distance with our reality, which is just a couple different words.
Yeah.
Not to be repetitive, but
I think the words are going to come up a lot. I think that's a big part of even what our main character Marcos is thinking about. And we have kind of his internal dialogue, and we even learn how he thinks about some of this stuff. And there is the part where he's thinking his government decided to rebrand the product. they gave human meat the name special meat. Instead of just meat, now there's special tenderloin, special cutlets, special kidneys. He doesn't call it special meat. He uses technical words to refer to what is a human but will never be a person, to what is always a product.
One of the biggest quotes of the book.
Totally. It is so much about how we use language to create distance, right? And that is something we do in real life too, right? Like we don't call like food dishes, I guess chicken, but most food dishes we have you like you I guess I would say euphemisms that we
100%.
use for names, right? Even you think about steak, we don't say I'm eating cow for dinner. Typically, we say I'm eating steak for dinner. That's not universally true, right? But I think also it kind of becomes more true the more intelligent we perceive the animal to be, I think. Because I think if you go to a restaurant, you order shrimp. And I think that's kind of like, I think people think of shellfish as like bugs. And as you get to something like pigs and cows, which are much more complex animals, which doesn't say whether like they're less deserving of being eaten, but they have more complex brains. And I think we see them as having more feelings, which I think is a big part of it for humans too, where we need to create that distance, and language is the only real way to do it if you're going to keep eating it.
Or them.
Yeah, thank you. I actually appreciate that as a, yeah, I appreciate you
My
saying that.
mom, when she was very, very young, like probably 5 or 6 years old, was offered by a family member tuna fish. And that was the first time that she had heard it not just phrased as tuna. And she, to this day, like has this memory of being like, tuna is a fish, and has never eaten fish since in her life. She eats certain animals, but not all of them, and that has really stuck with me as somebody who also went vegetarian at a fairly young age because of things that I saw that were like connected to me,
Mm-hmm.
in ways that hadn't been connected before. And I think the language does have a lot to do with that. You're talking about the restaurants and the words that we use, and you're not eating a baby cow, you're eating veal, and there is a status with veal.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were going to say that you were going to eat a baby animal, I think that the connotation in that would be really different. Same with lamb,
Mm-hmm.
and what this book tries to do is make the alternative special, right? It's not bad. It's special. There's a huge connotation with that skewing positively. But people, I think, do something very similar where, if you're ordering milk in a coffee shop, you'll hear somebody be like, I just want normal milk. And you're like, cool, what's normal milk? Like, okay, you probably mean cow's milk, like cow dairy milk, but is that 2%, 1% whole? Like, you saying, I just want the normal thing, which is typically the tone that people who say that will take.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, but what's normal to you is not normal factually, right? It's whatever you make it. And these qualifiers exist in food so much, and it's especially regulated, and it's either industry terminology, which also creates distance, right? We don't say like congealed tissue, we say gelatin, right? We call it collagen, which is a technical and a biological term, but it also doesn't really imply body parts, right? We have all of these different words that aren't incorrect, but they all create that distance, even if they help to specify things. Like we call things confectioner's shellac, which can typically be made by like crushed up exoskeletons of bugs. And there's a lot in there that unless you know what it sounds like or what to look for, that you wouldn't otherwise, because we don't educate around these words. We just use them enough that either you don't ask questions or you don't want to ask questions.
Yeah.
And some people don't mind it. Some people, when you confront it with that, is they're okay with it. And as somebody, you're saying, like, people don't typically say, the animals that they're eating. And that's something over the past few years I have tried to do, is because I have to qualify everything that I eat is a vegan this or a plant-based this or a soy this. Like, if it's soy milk, then you're drinking cow's milk. If it's not a bad thing, then I can say it. And that maybe isn't normal to a lot of people, but I'm trying to make it normal for myself, because words do have the ability to just like shape and shift what we perceive and also what we do. And I think if that can make the connection for somebody, I'm not trying to get somebody to not drink cow's milk. I just want to just make that connection so that maybe somebody can have that reaction like my mom did and make the connection. And if they want to change their actions, their choices, they can. We can't do that unless we start with that kind of education and connection, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I think that it does take those moments, and I think it takes, this sounds weird, but I think that it sort of takes doing it mindfully to really decide if you want to do it. Or at least approaching it mindfully to decide if you want to, if you really want to do it. And you're someone who I've talked to about like my own kind of journey around animal products, and I think that I've always really appreciated the way that you approach it, because I do think that you do a really good job of being really clear about what your stance is and what your, I guess, perspective, or I don't want to say argument because that sounds argumentative, but like what your point is, right? But in a way that it feels like an open door instead of a closed door, which I don't think everybody is always successful at, not just with veganism, but just kind of in the world. And I think that there are going to be moments that are, I think, going to hit that way for people. I do think it's worth doing that, even though I'm sure it's uncomfortable for other people and probably uncomfortable for you on some level, knowing that, you know, people may have weird reactions to that. But I also think that language is powerful. That's why it's such a big part of the book. And that's why even the main character is so hyper aware of it all the time. I think it's not just because of the punishments he would face, but because he's really is aware of like the mechanism of action of these words.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do appreciate that. I think studying nutrition communications is helpful. You learn, what things people react to and don't react to. It's a lot, but I think it's also, being Jewish, I don't believe in proselytizing. And I think once I made that connection fairly early on in my veganism of like, oh, I don't have to be the pushier vegan of like, I'm trying to get you to do this, but I am, like, you're right, I am somebody who's proud of the stance that I have and confident enough in my choices, not in a way that I don't want to learn more, but I think about this a lot, and it's easier to have that conversation. I think it's easier to engage with this kind of material too when you don't have like an end goal beyond having a conversation or making the connection. And my biggest goal with what I do professionally is I want people to make informed choices. If you have the information, right? If we had more transparent industries and you were okay with how everything was going, then you get to make the choices that you make. And that's not something that I'm interested in changing, but I am interested in hearing why, like very genuinely, without being like, I want to hear why so I can make you do something different. It's just I'm so curious how people think and talk and engage around this. And so I think that this book is a great opportunity for that, even from the main character and how he changes over time, even in his very cyclical journey. I mean, we're doing some spoilers. Spoilers are okay.
Yeah, we're gonna cover that. We're gonna talk about the ending, so we're good.
So, like, he comes full circle and he doesn't eat meat after the loss of his child. And eventually, at the end of the book, it's insinuated that he's probably going to be eating meat again, human meat or not non-human meat, but
That's interesting. I don't know if I read it that way.
no.
I read it more as a self-preservation thing, but I think that's valid. I think that I do think that that's
Ooh.
totally possible that he could kind of fall back into complacency after what happened. So I'm gonna turn that over in my head, I guess, until we get to the end.
Yeah, I'm very curious. Let's get there.
Yeah. I think one of the things I appreciate about the narration of this book so much is that even though we see him participating in this system, we see the distress that it causes him, and we see his judgment of the system alongside his perceived inability to step out of it or do anything about it. And this is where we get a lot of his thoughts about the words. And the first time that we really see him in the processing plant that he works at, there's this passage that says, "Another day of slaughtering humans. No one calls them that," he thinks, as he lights a cigarette. He doesn't call them that when he has to explain the meat cycle to a new employee. They could arrest him for it or even send him to the municipal slaughterhouse and process him. Assassinate him would be the correct term, but it can't be used. While he removes his soaked shirt, he tries to clear the persistent idea that this is what they are: humans bred as animals for consumption. His brain warns him that there are words that cover up the world. There are words that are convenient, hygienic, legal. And I think that last bit, especially that there are words that cover up the world, is so much of the book's thesis. I don't think it's the only one, but I do think it's a big part of it. And so yeah, if you don't want to hear us talking about words, you're probably listening to the wrong episode. But it's such a big piece of how do we live like this? And I think that's kind of the question that our main character is examining the whole time, is like, how do I live like this? And we don't really see him resolve that question, particularly in a satisfying way. But I think his inability to resolve it, I think also does highlight how difficult to resolve it could be under those types of circumstances.
Yeah, I think it also changes. I don't know if I agree that we don't get a satisfying resolution in almost any sense of this book. I don't. Definitely not something where the plot, like, you can follow it and be like, yeah, this is, yeah, I guess satisfying. But I think what you mentioned too about his role in it, he even at one point says, and I don't have the exact quote in front of me, how he would never kill, but he instructs other people. He trains other people. He recruits
Mhm.
them to do the killing, to do the slaughtering, and he doesn't shy away from his role in that. But it seems like it's, I gotta do what I gotta do, and some parts of me sees him as the character as a, like, oh, I'm a good boy, right? I'm one of the good ones because I know that the system is bad. I'm not just one of the other people on the line who, like, clearly doesn't mind, wants to stay in the job of stunning and killing, does not want to move up the ladder, does not want to be taken out of the slaughter line, and he sees himself as, to me, kind of above that. But he's also aware that he's instructing them and he's part of it and he's integral to the killing. He's so close to that self-actualization, but to me he stays in the, like, not all men type of vibe where it's like, but not
Yeah.
me. Even if it's not explicitly, he thinks he is better, but he's not innocent. It's kind of the same intellectualization that I think a lot of people go to therapy with, being like, well, I know that I do this, but knowing that and doing the work to change that aren't the same thing. It's like, great, you know it, what are you doing about it? And I think especially when we're people who are higher up in systems, okay, you know it's bad. If you don't do anything about it, right, are you more innocent? Is it better or worse? Who is more responsible? I think those are, like, also questions and, moral qualms that this book does a great job of bringing up and making you confront through his eyes.
Yeah. I definitely see the "I'm one of the good ones" angle on him for sure, and I do agree, and I think that one of the things about books and movies that I like so much is that it will take a character like this that would be really hard for me to empathize with if I met them in real life, and put me in their head, and
Mm.
like, really push me to empathize with them despite the choices that I see them making. Ultimately, up until the last page of the book, I feel more sorry for him than angry at him. And I think that when I push myself in real life to think about people who are complacent and therefore complicit, I also feel mostly sorry for them when I allow myself, not allow myself even, when I have the strength and emotional range to do that, which isn't all the time, especially if it's something that I feel more affected by. The author does such a good job of alternating between what Marcos is going through and what Marcos is complicit in and contributing to. By the time, so I'm just going to spoil the ending because I don't really know how to say this without. So he is eventually gifted a female head, so a woman who is not allowed to be a woman, a person. And at the very end, he does kill her. And by the time he kills her, I'm actually genuinely surprised, even though I sort of think there's no other way that things could have ended. One of them was going to die, ultimately. That doesn't make it okay. I kind of think it should have been him, but those were the only two endings that there could have been. And so it was interesting because I did feel so empathetic towards him and so bad for him because the hatred and judgment that he throws at other people, I feel like you see it creeping around at himself too. And you see it in like the bitterness and the dissociation and his kind of,
Selfishness, I would argue.
I think selfishness for sure, but I think it's a weird kind of selfishness that he doesn't even really get to feel like it benefits him.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a super fair assessment. And I wonder too, the cycle in the book, right? He and his wife lose a child
Mhm.
who had been born, and the wife goes away,
Yeah.
right? And the only time, it seems like his distress gets more distressing. You know, he loses his father. The father in the um, facility eventually passes away, and he has to deal with that. So now his wife is gone, his father is gone. He's creating more distance with his sister. He gets more erratic and chaotic through the book, but I also think that the ending, when I say comes full circle, is, you know, he stops eating meat when his son dies and his wife leaves. But by the end, it comes back, and his I don't kill. I don't want to be part of this. I don't want the FGP. I don't want to, you know, he slams his sister for keeping someone in their house to eat.
Mm-hmm.
Then he kind of loses his convictions once he starts getting the stuff back in his life. When he starts getting when his wife eventually comes back, when he gets another baby, like that's when he loses his commitment to no meat, no killing very quickly, like instantaneously. And I think that that part to me, it was surprising at first, but in hindsight, I'm like, oh yeah, that seems very like it was self-serving. It was depression, and things changed, and he acted like a depressed person does when they get confronted with something else, and might become violent, or might just change their values or whatever to be like, I can fix this now. There's an out in his life, and that brings, like, once he gets better-ish, or his life gets better, his actions kind of get worse.
Yeah. And in killing her, he almost gets this chance to hit the reset button on everything.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. But he doesn't just kill her, right? He takes her to slaughter himself. That's the part to me where I'm curious, and I know we're getting way off track ahead of it, but I am curious when we get there how you see it as, like, maybe not him eating meat, because I think it is a big question mark. But I think consuming meat is his arc, but he's very clear that he's not a veganoid, as they call him. Which, like, I honestly might put in my bio.
Yeah, I kind of do love it. I think, I mean, I can even just answer it now, but I don't necessarily think he is, like, explicitly still not eating meat. I guess I was thinking about it from more of a self-preservation lens, which is still selfish, but just like a different angle on selfish, essentially, of I need to kill her and I need to provide evidence that I have, like, processed her properly so that I can move on with my life. I still think it's totally possible that he does end up eating her and going back to eating meat. I mean, I think it really could go either way. But I think I was reading it more as, like, part of the reset button. And, like, if she is not properly taken care of in a way that will be satisfactory to the people who are going to come check this out, then I won't be able to hit the reset button and I won't be able to just kind of move on with my wife and my baby.
That's such a different, yeah, I love it. I mean, it's not a subtle book in a lot of ways, but I think there are a lot of points that are super open to interpretation.
Regardless of if it is to eat or not, he is once again more willing to sacrifice someone else in the most literal sense.
Yeah. And violently.
Very violently. Yeah. He does, like you said, I mean, he isn't the one killing, but he is kind of running the place and he's taking in new people. And we even have the scene where there's the job interview with these two men who come to apply for a job. I don't remember the specific position, but when they're there, essentially, Marcos is tasked with walking them through the entire process, and they have to see every single step that happens. And it's described pretty gruesomely. This is one of the parts I didn't feel like I needed to particularly have quotes from. But one of them is basically his girlfriend is pregnant. They're desperate to have some money, and he knows he can get some money if he can get hired here. And the other one turns out to basically be like a looky-loo who is there to watch the carnage and, like, take it in.
Even with his recording on his phone, like really into it.
Yeah, way too into it. And so you're thinking about the people that come through there, and it's this combination of probably, like, desperate and depraved. And some people are more depraved and some people are more desperate, but it's all people who are not in a good place ultimately.
And he says, if you didn't react poorly to this, like, something is wrong with you. He's saying that if you are the depraved one, you don't belong in this system, which is, like, very interesting that even in that point, you could make the distinction to say, no, there's absolutely no way I would hire this guy. I want the one who's, like, literally almost sick in the corner over it to be here.
Yeah.
It is interesting in if you can cherry pick who's in your system, that you would go with the person who doesn't want to be violent to do one of the most violent jobs. And I wonder, I don't know enough about slaughterhouse workers or meat packing. I know the statistics and things like that. I know generally, but like I wonder too how that goes in our world too, that like hiring process and who is involved. And I'm sure that there are a lot of people who fall into desperate and a lot of people who fall into depraved or maybe indifferent.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a possible third one or just a subset of the depraved.
Yeah. I think it's probably both, right? Like there's the kind of natural indifference of the depraved and there's the forced indifference of the desperate.
Yeah.
Right? If you can't make yourself indifferent, you probably won't last. And if you're desperate, you
Yeah.
have to last. And it was I thought that was like a really interesting sequence to show. I also was thinking as I was watching it, I don't know so much about slaughterhouses, meat packing. Like I don't know this process that well, but a lot of what was in the book does mirror what I do know about the actual meat industry and like what is done to the animals that are there. It was pretty intense. Like the process that it walks through is pretty intense. I think one of the harder sequences to read in the book.
I think that is one of the most effective things that it does. In the very early on, one of the first scenes that you're walked through is Marcos on his like what meat tour, I guess, but he doesn't just go to breeding facilities and slaughterhouses. He also goes to a skin factory. And like, yes, it seems crazy in this world to be like a skin factory and a person who seems like a psychopath, kind of just focused on skin, and that's his business and everything. But that's just leather. It's just truly, it's the same industry with a different name, and then it's very similar where they're walking through with the German who is here to potentially become a client of El Gringo, right, who owns the breeding facility. And there's another kind of comparison too of, okay, Marcos and this German are being, and I'm not trying to be crass, that's just literally kind of what they call him in the
Yeah.
book, being walked through another facility and seeing it from that direction, from a client perspective rather than like a potential employee, and Marcos as a participant versus the one leading the tour. And even in that first scene, it takes you through, right? We go to the skin, then we go to this breeder facility that has the dairy section of this, and not just that, but like people that they can taste, right? And the descriptions of the dairy part, right? It's females hooked up to milking equipment, kept in cages, separated from their children. They have to keep them separated from their children so that they are more docile, less willing to fight. They want their child. I think those are very much same concept with slight changes in language, because that's exactly what the factory farmed dairy industry does. And I thought that was like, it's incredible to be walked through the system in this way with the commentary that's there. I read an online review. I already told you this offline, but I read an online review where somebody just kind of said that this book was like nothing. It was not substantive or whatever, that there was no commentary on society. And I can't imagine reading those sections and having the cognitive dissonance to just be like, well, this is just a dystopian world that has nothing to do with me.
Right.
And it's like, that is exactly what happens. I don't know about the eating parts of people while they're alive. I have a separate conversation about that later, but like, how can you read that and not even try? Like, how much are you entrenched in that industry, in that propaganda, in that mindset, if you can't even try to contemplate how this is a mirror to our industry?
Yeah. I think that would take so much closed offness to not see it. I mean, and I think it's kind of funny because to say anything is just a dystopian story that has nothing to do with us is kind of hilarious, because what dystopian story isn't an exploration of an extreme version of something that's already happening? That's kind of why that subgenre of things exists.
Yeah.
So I'm like, what else are you reading, dude? to the person who wrote that.
Yeah, it wasn't like a Reddit post. This is somebody who reviews horror literature or horror media. And I was like, really? Not even? What are you doing? I didn't read any of the other ones, and again, it's not my genre, but yeah, somebody who is essentially making themselves out to be somebody who reviews this kind of stuff, and to not even be able to do that is, I think, interesting in itself. It's not necessarily wrong, but it is wild to me the different ways that you can come at this book just based on your own perspectives, life experience, and ability to engage with intellectual honesty about things that make you uncomfortable.
I think that this book really is so demanding that you take it seriously in that way too, that it's really hard to imagine, because I do think sometimes when I read or watch things that are this unsettling, and let's say surface level unsettling, like even before you start thinking that hard about it, it's like pretty disturbing. I think sometimes when you take something like that in, it is harder to see past just the part of you that feels really disturbed into like the nuance of that disturbance, and like if there's more going on than just like, ugh, gross, like people, right? People dying.
The puppy scene.
Ugh, the puppies. Well, and so something that I do think is really interesting is that even in the horror genre, and I think this is something that I know to be true for myself, the puppy scenes where the puppy scene is the hardest scene for me in the entire book somehow.
I did not reread it. I could not reread it.
Yeah. So Marcos basically goes to this abandoned zoo to unwind. He has memories of his father there from when he was young, and his father was still not just healthy, but with it mentally.
Although not happy. Words were empty there.
Yeah. He goes there and he sees a group of puppies, and he's so excited that he basically says he would like to die for the puppies to have food because he's so happy to see them. And then he returns later on, and I'm not like, this is another one I did not pull any excerpts for, but he sees like a group of young teenagers or tweens, like young boys killing the puppies. And something that is really interesting to me is that even in the horror genre, animals are often seen as off limits or a step too far. Like if you watch a slasher movie and like a dog dies, you're like, oh my God, that's kind of a lot, right? But you've just watched like
Right?
7 people get murdered in like creative and weird ways.
I literally use that "does the dog die" before I watch anything,
Yeah.
which is expansive, but the name is
Yes.
telling.
Yeah, totally. It is interesting, and I guess it's so this isn't something I had thought about outside of context here, but in thinking about it in the context of this book, it's interesting how in fiction we are so distraught over the harming of animals, and then like in real life we become so detached from it. I think a lot of people are also detached from human suffering, but I think fewer people are detached from human suffering, and it's so interesting how that is like flipped in that way.
Yeah, I think it also in real life depends on the animal, and that's where this species is kind of comes back to it. I have no. I mean, if I stopped watching Game of Thrones because in like the first episode, these made up fake wolves were killed, and I was like, I'm done. I can't. And then I feel bad about myself that I can't engage. I'm like, I'm not even experiencing it. I know this is fictional, and I like can't even engage with it because it gnaws at me and it's like physiologically
Mhm.
uncomfortable. And I try to sit with it sometimes as us like I should bear witness to it, but it is animal suffering is incredibly difficult. And I do think that people have different reactions to maiming or killing of a dog or a cat, again, somebody that's seen as domesticated versus a cow. Although, I don't think somebody would enjoy,
Watching.
maybe a healthy, somebody wouldn't enjoy that as entertainment, but we do rodeos and we do, we might not think of it as a bad thing, but to me, watching a cooking show like Chopped, there are animals used as meat and like being broken down, which is a normal part of life. Even that to me is almost as like grotesque as the maiming of a dog. And I think that there's another quote in here that encapsulates my own perspective and how I live, which is meat is meat. To me, I understand the societal differences between eating certain species, but we also have that reaction in certain places. You don't eat certain animals. Those are not animals for
Yeah.
food, right? And it's not that they have a first and last name. It's just a no-no, right?
Yeah. I mean, I have guinea pigs, and that's, that those are domesticated because they were food first.
Right. I'm not trying to sound again crass, but like eating a dog, eating a horse, eating a cow, eating a pig, to me at this point in my life, are equitable. The ways that you do it, I understand, right? And people, it's not necessarily a choice. It's what's ingrained in society. It's what you have access to. It's not a judge on a person in particular, but this quote, meat is meat to me. I think that that is, like I said, the cornerstone of this world.
Yeah. And I think, oh, I mean, one of the things that I remember thinking the first time that I read it and have been thinking this whole time is that I actually think a lot of the world would be more set up to make this transition than to make a transition away from animal products.
People will do literally anything to avoid sustaining themselves on plants or like figuring out a different
Yeah.
way. And I think it's really interesting because this book was fairly recent. It was released or published in
Mhm.
2020, right? There's like a brief mention of we tried crops, but we couldn't feed people, right? I don't know how hard you tried or what's going on in this dystopian universe, but there is, besides the brief mention of like vegans, veganoids, activists, whatever, like there is no mention of if you have the ability to genetically modify and grow heads, living beings, whether or not they have all their limbs or whatever, but you're growing a living being. Like we're in a point in society where we can literally grow meat in petri dishes, not at scale, not great yet, but like I wonder why the author didn't go that direction of like, oh, we tried this or whatever, and was just this is the way we're going to go into fully raising, breeding humans.
Yeah. I do think that's really an interesting thing to think about. And I think as someone who has so many struggles with food, I have such a desire for like lab grown meat that is never alive like that to be available. And as a person who does try to think about the state of the world and like the things that are going on, I am also constantly wondering if that funding and time and energy and resources was put into real alternatives,
What do you mean real?
non-meat, plant-based
Of
or
course,
other sorts of things.
sure.
Yeah, like real alternatives to meat, because lab grown meat ultimately is meat.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it is something that's really
Don't
interesting.
let the industry hear you say that,
Right.
or the
Yeah.
government.
And I'm also the first to say that I would feel differently about eating it, but it's just interesting. I think it speaks
Yeah,
to the desperation to hold on to those products and like hold on to like what we see as normal
yeah,
in the face of all these problems, because if we were more willing to loosen our grip, maybe not even let go all the way, but just loosen our grip on it, those resources might be put into other things that could make more of a difference. And that's already very telling.
yeah. And I think the industry, the alternative protein industry, does engage with that a lot. And I think that there is room in that world. Separate conversation for another time, but like, is a both and, right?
Mhm.
Can we do both? But there is a lot that is going into getting the industry started, and it could either very much go into the same unethical system that we have now, or we have an opportunity to change it and be better. And I have zero naivete in which direction it's going to go, but I'm still heartened by it in that maybe we could reduce, like if we're going to be spending the resources one way or another, maybe we could reduce at least the suffering of the people who work in these slaughterhouses, in the industry. We could reduce the zoonotic diseases and the antibiotic resistance that come from raising live animals. And we could then have all of the crops that go to feed the live animals to people. But I also think what you said is really interesting too, because we are also at a point where people are criminalizing, not people, governments are criminalizing the alternative protein industry. Like Florida is one of those where you're like not allowed to sell lab grown meat. Italy has really strict rules. I think it's been changing recently, but they had at one point a law that was saying like you will not sell this in this country for this commitment to industry.
And that's it, right? Commitment to industry.
It's very much like in Italy, this is an Italian thing, that this is for our country. It becomes patriotic, it becomes a symbol, and you are trying to undermine everything that we stand for as a country, really, to just to preserve this industry,
Yeah.
right? They are so committed to not exploring those kinds of alternatives.
Yeah.
For what?
Totally. And I think about even, I mean, I think that's true kind of in America too, broadly, because I think about like, I think I usually see this, like, it's usually men saying this, but you see people who are like, I'm going to eat 2 steaks today so that like a vegan's work means nothing.
At least 3 times a day.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and the carnivore diet right now. Oh my God. There's like so many, there are so many tangents, but I think, yeah, I mean, I do think it's just, it's so interesting that it like people are so uncomfortable about it that they can't even just leave it alone.
No,
Truly, what difference does it make for you as like a person who eats meat if someone else is choosing not to do that?
there's a lot of anger. I am a vegan on the internet and I have been
Yeah.
for a while. I feel like I've heard it all, and it's very interesting. The most interesting thing to me is because I feel like I've gotten to the point where those things don't bother me, right? It's annoying as shit to sift through those comments or to have people say it out loud, and you're like, are you really? That's what you
Yeah.
think? But I think what's the most interesting to me, and looking at this like as societal commentary, bringing it back to like the normative stuff of the world, is so many different kinds of people have those thoughts, and I think that maybe the internet is responsible for it. But there's been the same reactions to vegans for a very long time, or anybody who right is the alternative in the group,
Hmm.
and there's enough of a pattern in people's reactions to you being the person who says no thank you, even if all you say is no thank you, and how deeply it is woven into the fabric of our society that tends to skew towards anger and violence and vitriol to somebody else who just simply says not for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, I mean, I think this makes me think too about kind of bringing it back to the book of if this is how it is now, with it as complicated
Mm.
as it already is, what do we think the vegans are treated like in this world where it is even more complicated, even more atrocious, like even more fraught with ethical dilemma? Not even, I mean, to call it an ethical dilemma is kind of even generous, but more personal, let's say.
Maybe that's the second book in the series, not the sequel you mentioned, but the other person somewhere out there. Maybe the second book is the perspective of somebody who already was a protester, just in how they acted and how they
Yeah.
were. I'm available if Augustina wants to to profile somebody else. No,
Yeah.
somebody who already stands against it. I think it would be very interesting to then see what is available, how it changes. Like I am so curious. Like even though I don't necessarily want to revisit all parts of these books, it does bring up so many other questions. I want to know what their food system is like
Right.
outside of this like humans raised for meat system. I am so curious how it changed everything
Mhm.
else, right? Because everything goes around this industry, and I'm wondering what the world. I mean, it seems like a terrible world.
Yeah.
People are afraid to go out without umbrellas in case a bird poops on them, which they could potentially die from. Like it is dystopian, but they still have to go to work. They still have to take care of their kids. They still have to take care of their aging parents. Like there is a lot of reality in there, and I am just so curious to be like, I wonder if there was any other world building that happened when this book was being written that considered what do grocery stores look like?
Yeah.
Because we only hear about butchers,
Yeah.
butcher shops, right? Like what else is there?
Yeah. So many questions about the world. And I agree. Like it would be really fascinating to get something about someone who is a protester. And it's interesting because they mention, like you said, veganoids in the book, which I do think is just really kind of funny and kind of weirdly cute. But they also have the protesters from that church. They have what's called the Church of the Immolation, which is a church that essentially has a volunteer periodically. I don't really remember what the time frame for this is, but periodically they randomly select a member of the church to die at the processing plant. There's a scene where we see this happen and it talks about, the process, and it says he smiles and recites the Church of the Immolation's creed passionately and with conviction. The human being is the cause of all evil in this world. We are our own virus. For me, part of that rings so true because humans do cause all of this pain and all of this suffering on ourselves, the planet, the animals, everything around us. But the vegans that I would listen to, and I would count you in this group, the vegans that I would listen to, hear from, and like look up to and admire are the ones who see, like, the human issues, like, you keep referencing the workers, right, in real life, whose compassion for animals is rooted also in their compassion for people, and just compassion for alive things and, like, living creatures, and so it's interesting that we get this kind of other side of protest of get like, people are awful, and then there's this side that was kind of unexplored of, like, people are hurting and suffering, and we need to figure out a better way.
Yeah, absolutely. It felt a little disjointed to me. Like there wasn't as much depth there as I would have hoped, but it is so interesting to know that it exists. And I kind of wonder too if we would put the scavengers, maybe that would be the perspective to really, if you wanted to really get into the dystopia of the world, to have somebody who's no longer Marco's second in command of this place, who has all these privileges, even in this fucked up world. Like, what are the grocery stores like? What is it like for the people who don't have the power, who aren't even having the opportunity to sacrifice themselves for money so that their family can live? Like, there's not even that level of opportunity. The only opportunity to live, clearly they're not getting enough food somewhere else. These are not people who are able to start gardens or to forage or to find anything else. I don't really also know how agriculture works if you have no animals. That might be a question of like, why are there no grocery stores or plants around? But if you have no other access and that is your only opportunity, what is the world like through that lens? The what I'm guessing is closer to the 99%.
Yeah. There's a I should get, like, I feel like I should have a sound effect for when I manage to bring up Stephen King in unrelated episodes because it's probably just all of them, but there's a Stephen King book called The Stand. It's, like, 1,000 something pages long, it's crazy. It's very good, it's an end of the world situation, and there's a short story collection coming out written by different authors writing about the world, basically, taking a period of time during what's happening in the stand and exploring other areas of the country or world and like other characters and just like what are they doing, what are things like for them. And I feel like that would be something that would be really cool to see for this world, where we get a short story about a veganoid protester, sorry, a short story about a scavenger, maybe a short story about the partner of someone like Marcos, like who maybe is feeling more conflicted than the person who's actually working there.
The FGP.
I don't know. I guess
I know.
yeah, I would like that, but I don't even know how you would do it
I don't either.
because they don't have language. Like, it's like one of the things so the FGPs in this world are they're first generation pure, and they are the first generation that have been born in the processing plants, so they're not taken from anywhere.
Yeah.
They have their vocal cords removed at birth, essentially, so that they never learn language. They are not taught language, obviously, as well. That is, I mean, right, just another way to kind of rob them of their humanity is that they can't communicate.
Oh, I think they do communicate.
They do, yes, but not in the way that people are looking for.
That 100%. But and you're right. Mine would not work in your series of short stories. I think it is really cool to be able to do that. I also think in the recent, and maybe this is my own. My own Stephen King is like in the recent Bob's Burgers series. They're doing episodes that are about like the kind of side characters that are close to the main cast, and I
Yeah,
love them because I like
yeah.
want to know the world, and I like that kind of media, that kind of genre. But I think
Mhm.
too, when going back to like you mentioned like my kind of veganism, the people who see it as like a people issue, and I would classify that there are vegans who see themselves as saviors, and I am not one of those. And I think a lot of the times, I mean, there's organizations called like Vegans for the Voiceless, and I think it's incredibly telling that you would say, not you, but like that you, Ethereal, would say they're voiceless when even in this, like they're shaking, they're
They're
trembling,
crying, right,
they're
yeah.
trying to cry out. Even Jasmine, the person, the FGP who bears Marcos's child, tries at her after giving birth to get to her child, even if she doesn't
Mhm.
have that language or the awareness of the world or that knowing maybe like there's just a primal connection there between maybe
Yeah,
it came from this birthing being.
yeah,
And I think that there is so much communication in the description of the tours and the slaughterhouse, right? Like they try to get away, and we hear the same thing with cows. They're scared, right?
yeah,
They say it's that you can hear testimony from slaughterhouse workers saying they know what's happening, and it creates fear and torture. And if you pay attention to them, and you don't think of them as, like people say, cows to slaughter, if you think of them as beings who are forced into this with no choice, who know what's coming and have zero way to advocate for themselves or break free, there is so much communication in that. And like in the book, most of the times, those animals that try to break free have a worse death.
Yeah.
Or they get out and they're a symbol for people. Oh, they escaped. Isn't that amazing? They're now living in a sanctuary. But it doesn't change anything.
Yeah.
Maybe their meat just tastes worse, like they say. It's just, I think that level of communication too, and the people who don't see it or won't recognize it, was a big part of this book that loves words and loves language, right? And I think that's a real problem with today too. I mean, my dog, I talk to my dog all the time,
Me
and
too.
where she talks back, I'm sure your guinea pigs do too. You learn them. It's not
Yeah.
verbal communication necessarily, although I have a part beagle and she is constantly whining,
Yeah.
grumbling at me. I love it, but like, she talks and she is sassy.
My dog is very sassy. She is
Right?
such a little brat.
Once you get to know them, and once you do that, like everybody, even a nonverbal human, communicates in some ways.
Yeah.
And I think that the vocal cords being taken out, I mean, it constructs this idea that like they can't talk, and what is really is like we've prevented ourselves from having to listen to them.
Right. That's a much better way of saying it, I think. It also speaks to, right, like the type of communication that we deem worthy.
Valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even in all the anthropomorphizing that we do with animals, like people, even the people who quote are vegan for the animals, some of them like won't engage in that. And maybe one more while I'm up on the soapbox a little bit, like one more
Yeah.
thing it makes me think of too is the idea that if you don't eat the meat, a lot of people say you're saving animals. If you go vegan, you save this many animals per day, per whatever. I understand how those statistics are crafted. I understand how they can be helpful and powerful. But let's look at Marcos, who doesn't eat meat through the whole book. How many animals did he save? Technically, he was given one quote animal, and then he killed them.
Yeah.
And I think that too is this idea of innocence, right? People that only have dairy, as we see, like there is no separation between the meat part of this industry and the dairy part of this industry and the skin. And it is not inherently better if all of the other actions that you're doing don't actually go towards actively saving, which he had the opportunity to do, and then really fucking didn't, And that's why too, like I don't ever say that the only animal I've quote saved is my dog. I have I don't know, I don't see a moral high ground in that because I can't change these systems, and I'm still somewhat of a participant in so many ways. And I think Marcos is like just the perfect encapsulation of like, just because you're not eating it doesn't mean that you are like a savior.
Yeah. While we're talking about how all these are so interconnected, I'm also thinking about when they go to the research center where there are experiments being done on these humans.
His last time at his limit, it's his last time there, our first time, but his absolute last.
Yeah, and you can see how fed up he is, honestly, like through this scene, that this is one of maybe I think this maybe appalls him the most out of everything. And the woman who works there, he talks about how in the early days they called her Dr. Mengele. She's doing experiments on humans, but then as the world shifted and it became more normal, she won prizes for her research, which I think is
that she brags about.
Yeah. I try again, this is another one. I pulled a couple of quotes. I tried to be mindful of which ones because these are not easy by any means to read or hear, but they are the easiest ones, I think, that I could pull to kind of just demonstrate the type of thing that was going on there. And there's a scene where she shows him a cage and tells him that the specimen is a heroin addict. They've been supplying him with the drug for years to understand why addiction occurs. When we nullify him, we'll study his brain, she says. Nullify, he thinks, another word that silences the horror. And then there's another one where it says they go up to a cage where a female appears to be dead and a baby that's 2 or 3 years old doesn't stop crying. She explains that they've sedated the mother to study the infant's reaction. What's the point? Isn't it obvious how the infant is going to react? Is Marcos's question. I think about some of the, it's like I studied psychology, obviously, and I'm sure you've heard of, some of the experiments that have been done. This one isn't even like as bad as some of them, but this was the one that came to mind is the monkeys with the cloth mother and the wire mother. And there's a study of baby monkeys who are taken away from their mothers. They are given a monkey figure made out of wire that has milk, and then a cloth monkey that is soft and cuddly that doesn't have milk, to see what they would prefer. And of course, they would still drink the milk, but they would spend basically the rest of their time with the cloth mother because the cloth mother could provide them comfort. What Marcos asks this woman is exactly how I feel about that experiment of like, what is the point? Like, isn't it obvious that this young creature would want comfort all the time as much as possible? It's a baby. And like I said, these are the easier to stomach examples of the experiments that were done. And I would go so far as to say that the worst ones probably do resemble the worst things that are happening to animals in labs right now.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's this need to prove it. Whether it's safety to prove something as fact, monkeys will, people, whatever, will go towards the warmth. Whether it's people who are like, wow, but cows get really upset when you take away their baby. That's why we have to calm the mothers and do certain things. And there's terror when the calf is removed from the mother so that the mother can be milked, right? Like it's stuff that, yeah, we know it, but what does it help? And the same with like, okay, so we know that lab rats have pathways for addiction. Great. Don't know why we need, like, we could assume that if you give an addictive substance to somebody, to some being, I'm guessing it would be addictive. And yes, it's maybe there's some scientific benefit to it, but there's a lot of stuff that we study on animals first that are a requirement, even though it doesn't really help us super long term. And one of the things that we just banned is a red dye that like is potentially carcinogenic because it can cause cancer in rats when they are exposed to a great amount to it. And here's the problem, is like we're not rats.
Yeah. And we're not having it like injected into our bloodstreams at these insanely concentrated amounts. Like, I think
Yeah.
we're kind of in different regions of like the conversation around relationship to food, but like there's overlap.
At what point can we use modeling, and would that not be more helpful? Even nutrition research in humans, although it has its start and still is, can be really ethically dicey. I would say at least the foundation of it all is extremely ethically dicey. But even in that, like, even in twin studies and experiments, like we cannot control all of the factors. And so you can prove it within the laboratory setting, you can prove it with modeling, you can prove it in longitudinal studies. That does not make it universally applicable. That's why like we challenge that in so many ways. We challenge that with BMI, right? Where it's like that's a static metric. We know it's a static metric. The issues of it have been proven since it was first used. And yet I learned it in grad school just a couple of years ago because it's the best we've got, so that we're not just using like anthropomorphic measurements and things that are like not ethical at all. I love science. I studied science. I went into debt over science, and especially nutrition science. It's confusing how much value we put into this just to come up with statistics and things that get taken into headlines and don't necessarily help advance us in ways that are meaningful, because we're not advancing. Some of it is incredible, right? Some of it is life-saving. I'm not discounting it completely, but like, at what point are we just doing it to be cruel?
Or even just to be right.
Write about it in such a specific, only this particular context, with these settings, with this margin of error, with this level of population.
Yeah. Well, and I think the interesting thing too, this actually even brings me to like another quote from the book. He asks this researcher, "Isn't it strange that no one's found a cure? What with laboratories that are so advanced that they're able to carry out cutting edge experiments?" Right? And he's talking about this virus that supposedly exists and how, why aren't we working on that? Like, you have this fancy ass lab, you have all this money, you have all these resources. Where's the work on something that could really save a lot of people? And that's obviously questionable because that gets into like the ethics of meat eating again. And so maybe doesn't save people as much as it would. But also, if this virus is real, why are we working on that? Why are we working on seeing what a baby will do if it thinks its mother is dead? Like what value is there in that? And what value are we missing by focusing on that?
Absolutely. I think the part before it that I just flipped to, because you pointed out something super interesting, is he suspects that the caged animals are a front. As long as someone is studying them and trying to find a cure, the virus is real. I
Yeah.
think that, again, with a lot of things, we can go back to BMI. As long as somebody is studying it and making, again, something I don't necessarily think of as very scientific and is problematic in a lot of ways, as long as somebody is studying obesity, it's
Yeah.
real. But it's only real, and so the fact that we've manufactured it and we keep it real, it's not real in that it tells us truths about the world. It tells us truths about all of the things that we've constructed to go into it, and then we can use it to do what? Not uplift people, not
Yeah.
protect people, not make scientific advancements, right? We've created industries around this thing now. We've manufactured a lot around it. And like, isn't it crazy that no one's found a cure, quote unquote, to this thing that's not real and doesn't need to be cured, maybe? How long are we going to go down this pathway
Yeah.
until we can accept what people are telling us, which is this isn't fucking real. And no matter how many times you study it, how much resources you put toward it, maybe isn't it just maybe crazy
Yeah.
that we're doing exactly this, that this is a front, and as long as we're studying it, we're keeping it real.
And I think there's a bit of probably less so with this crazy researcher lady who is pretty
Angela, for
seems pretty
sure.
horrid and like pretty violent, but I think more broadly there's also some sunk cost fallacy in there, right? Of I've already poured these resources and I've already put this time and energy in, and if I decide that this is no longer worth my time, I will have wasted my time.
God forbid you should waste your time.
Right. And like that sucks. That certainly would suck to realize for sure. Not to say that wouldn't be distressing, but does that make it worth it? I would personally say no. I think probably some people wouldn't even be willing to ask that question though.
Going back to the animal ag industry, at what point are you going to realize that what you've done, what you've created, this, you got it to this point where we're so efficient, but now we're having to kill birds by the millions because of bird flu. We're having people who are like,
Yeah.
how many more externalities need to happen before there's a reckoning, or do we just kind of have to give up on there ever being a reckoning, and that sunk cost is now just how the world works? There's no
Yeah.
out, seemingly no out.
Yeah. As soon as we start saying this is how the world works, we know we're in bad territory. We know we're in dangerous territory, right? Because
Bo Burnham.
right. Yeah. And so we're like walking through all of these scenarios. And, you also mentioned the hunting. I think the last thing that we can talk about world building wise, and then we can kind of get into the relationship with his FGP, Jasmine, is the only other location we get insight into, which is the game reserve, where people who owe money can essentially be assigned to, well, I think they volunteer, but will volunteer under duress, not literally volunteer, but they owe money and they're able to, instead of paying the money, be there for a certain number of days. And if they survive, they get to go home
Debt free.
debt free. And, curious how many of them survive. But there's an interesting exchange here where Marcos asks one of the people working there, so they're willing to die because they owe money. And the guy says, there are people willing to do atrocious things for a lot less, like hunting someone who's famous and eating them. Right. And that there's the things people do out of desperation. And then there are the things people do out of, I guess, again, going back to the idea of like being like the depraved, right? The depravity. And how do we even get there? I think is so hard to understand, like what could make someone be interested in doing that.
Yeah.
And I feel that way about big game hunters in real life. Like I don't really understand. I don't really understand that. I think there must be something about like dominance in there and power. I don't know, but it's a very hard thing for me to wrap my brain around.
Hunting for sport, and also hunting. Another word that gives you separation is what it really is killing for sport.
Killing.
The hunting,
Yeah.
I understand it's the act of doing it, but what you're a successful hunt is murder.
Yeah. And I even think about like where we kind of like use the term hunting from, of like hunting and gathering, and how like I would argue almost that hunting for sport doesn't exist, and that it is hunting if you are going to use the animal, in whatever ways that makes sense. Again, a whole like loaded ethical question there, but I would say that maybe there is no hunting for sport because maybe that's not what hunting actually is. And that we are kind of all kidding ourselves when we call it that, in the same way you said, right? The real word is killing for sport.
Yeah, absolutely. I could see that. I agree with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Dark.
It is really dark, and I appreciate you returning to such heavy material to talk about it with me, because I really wanted to talk about it, and you were the first person I thought of. Like, and not just because you had already read it, because I think I could probably twist some arms to get people to read it if I wanted to, but I just like really we did talk about it a little, but I really was excited to like dive into the weeds of it with you.
Thank you, and likewise. Yeah, I'm not unaccustomed to darkness.
Yeah. I think part of your like work that you do, and just kind of the things I understand about you as a person, are like a willingness to sit with the reality, and the reality usually is kind of dark. We live in a pretty dark time.
Yeah, I think that's why I like a lot of the media that I do, that I wouldn't necessarily say it is horror, but we both also like BoJack Horseman,
Yeah.
and like I like Bob's Burgers. I like these cartoons that are able to encapsulate these kinds of really heavy and fucked up and gross and sad things, and like make you deal with it in the way that I think if you were looking at non-animated humans wouldn't work. Like I don't think I could watch BoJack Horseman like a live version of it. It's like it's horrible, right?
Yeah.
But also in a lot of that media, like sure it seems like it's a cartoon, but it deals with a lot of these issues too. I mean, like in the first season of Bob's Burgers, I mean, take a shot every time I say it. I don't care. Um, there's an episode where they confront a vegan activist confronts Bob with a cow.
Yeah.
You
They
eat,
also have their little cannibalism thing in the first episode.
yeah, meat your meat, right? And
Yeah.
that's why I like it too. And then I have to bring this up is the Chicken for Days episode of BoJack Horseman, because it is truly like interconnected in my mind of like Marcos, if he was in an animated series and it as a horse that has a lot of problems. In it, there's a chicken company, and that's like a recurring thing throughout the show, Chicken for Days, and it's nobody knows chicken like chicken, so it's chicken farmers farming chickens. But
Yeah.
obviously, the chicken farmers are at a different level of chicken than the chickens being farmed. But their whole thing is the same kind of pastoral marketing that we see in Tender is the Flesh and a lot of other stuff, which is like, happy cows make the best milk, or like chickens, no chickens, so like we should be the ones that farm it. And talk about being like the person at the top in the system responsible, like, for it all. And in it, right, one of the chickens breaks out of the truck and transport or whatever and
Yeah.
finds another one of the characters, and the whole show is them trying to rescue the chicken, and then being like, well, we're going to bring her to this chicken place because this chicken farm is better than the standard. And then they quickly realize, like, oh, it is not. That is just at face value. And then they try to break out the chicken, and it is so interesting because they house it, they hide her from the authorities, they give her a name, they give her clothes, and it is like the Chicken for Days of it all is like the media grappling with this idea of like the happy farming nonsense that is pure greenwashing, pure humane washing.
Yeah.
And I like that there's media that can make us do that and sit with it in ways that, like, again, I think if you were just watching it and maybe like the person who reviewed this saying that this book wasn't substantive, right? Like, you don't really pay attention to it. These are just funny episodes. But if you look at it, again, it's could not be a bigger mirror.
Totally.
And I like that people are creative enough to like deal with that. They don't make you feel better about it. There's like, of
No.
course, a silly ending or whatever because these are like shenanigans in TV shows, but
Yeah.
what they get you to think about if you choose to pay attention to it, is not it's not easy.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's important. And that's the thing. I think that like there are so many different avenues towards it, right? And I think horror is one that is like a preferred one for me. But I think there are a lot of other places that these conversations come up in important ways. And it is worth taking the time to think about them that way. And I think that something that I know is true for me that I think isn't true for everybody is that when I watch horror and read horror, it moves feelings around. It doesn't make them go away, which I think wouldn't it's not how people work anyway, but it just moves them around, which gives me more perspective and like makes my brain work more and also makes me, I think, process some of the feelings and kind of move through them so that I can actually think about stuff.
Yeah, it's we need it. I mean, especially at a time where books are getting banned and we're getting limited in what we can say, what we can write about, what the news can report on. Like, I don't know, right? There's a thing about like art flourishing in the darkest times, and it's also that like maybe the darkest themes can flourish through art. I
Yeah.
bet like we need it in order to process it in the way that people can do it and captivate us in a way that may be entertaining or just illuminating or like powerful. I mean, that is the beauty of creators, of people who really know how to take the world and all of its horrors and package it in a way that like you can consume it and think about it
Yeah.
and talk about it for like 2 hours.
Yeah, and we've gotten so far into this without even really talking about Jasmine, right? Like there was so much to explore. And so as all of this is happening and all of these like topics are being discussed, he has this FGP female that he calls Jasmine. He names her. And
After a few days, he names her.
yeah, after a few days, he names her. He starts to kind of care for her the way you would a pet, not the way you would a child or a person.
She becomes an inside animal, not an outside animal.
Right. And eventually he crosses the line and he sexually assaults her. I don't remember it being particularly graphic, but it's clear what's happening.
Well, it's through his perspective, and I don't think he thinks of it as particularly graphic.
True. Yeah, for sure.
Probably,
I
yeah,
also appreciate it not being particularly graphic though.
yeah. I mean, there are other parts in it that absolutely, yeah, 100%. Yeah, continue.
Yeah. And there is a flash forward in time at one point where she is now like very, very pregnant, very far along. And he's kind of preparing for the day that she goes into labor and gets all these things ready because he knows he can't really get any help because this is so very illegal what he's done. And when she's very pregnant, an inspector comes to his home because these head are kept very thorough track of. This is a really kind of diligent process on the part of the industry and the government. I think like jointly together, the industry and the government. And Marcos, because of his position, is able to pull strings and is able to essentially not have a real inspection and just have some papers signed and call it a day. When the inspector is leaving, Marcos thinks to himself, he smiles in a way that's artificial, tense. It's a smile that hides several questions and one threat. What are you doing with the female? Are you enjoying her? And enjoy is the kind of common euphemism for assaulting the head. And it goes on to say, are we talking illegal use of another's property? Just you wait until El Gordo Pineda isn't around anymore. Just you wait with your special privileges. You're going to pay. And then as he's leaving, the inspector, who seems to be like young and kind of new to his job, looks at Marcos and says, this job would be pretty easy if everyone could just sign and not do anything else, don't you think? So he has him like read to rights and just like feels powerless to do anything about it.
The system does not work, or it works how it was supposed to, but it's not working, right?
Right. Right. Nobody's benefiting from that system other than Marcos. Eventually, she does go into labor and there are problems evident. And he's done enough research to know that there are problems. And I believe his wife is a nurse and he calls her and basically is like, I need you to come over here and like have your nurse hat on and not worry about asking me questions.
Not seeing each other for like months, like not having interaction, not really talking, like her not being at the home. He's like, no questions, you need to come now.
Yeah.
And I need you not to be my wife. I need you to be professional.
Yeah.
Which is a crazy ask.
It's a crazy ask. It's crazy that she shows up and does it. It's unbelievable. And you can only imagine what she must have been thinking was in store for her. But she does show up and she does successfully deliver this child, this child who she's looking at, and he's looking at, and they're like, this could be our child. We lost a child, and this could kind of be our new child.
It is technically, unfortunately.
It is, yeah, it is his child, but I
Not
think
his, but
yes, totally. Not only his, because it is Jasmine's, and like you mentioned before, she's trying to get the baby back. She's trying to hold the baby. She is trying to cry out for her child even though she can't. And that is when he kills her. And this is the last page, literally the last page of the book is he kills her, and his wife actually says, maybe the most one of the more shocking parts of the book, where his wife says to him, why she could have given us more children, that she would want to keep her and use her to breed because they've been unable to have children.
part of me agrees that it's like super unexpected and weird, but we don't really know her so much. And to me, this is very much Cecilia, the wife, sees Jasmine, the person who just gave birth, not a person, as an animal.
Mm-hmm.
As does, right, the very last like line in the book or whatever, like,
Yeah.
or second to last or whatever. Like, I think a lot of people are like Cecilia, where I think she was grossed out. I think she realizes that it's just horrifying and shocking, especially since it means that her husband has done this like vile act. But at the same time, like, Jasmine isn't it. She has no problem picking up the baby. She's not mad that the birthing person just lost their life. She's mad that he took away future opportunities for production, and like, that's what people do with a lot of people do with animals.
Yeah. I think what surprised me was almost that she would be able to see the baby as a person, but not see the mother as a person. I think that's what's so interesting to me. And where the unexpectedness came in was like, you are not able to see the humanity in the person who just delivered this baby, who you helped, hands on helped delivered this baby. But you see this baby and see that it's a human baby and that it could be a person, and you're going to take it and raise it, which is just fascinating, like cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, and I would push on that a little bit to say too that we do that with animals, right? Like, a baby animal is different. I mean, biologically, through nature, through evolution, it's supposed to feel different, right? And it's apparently for us too. It's, especially if you are the birthing person, you are supposed to see babies and feel a connection to them, supposedly, right? That is primal, that is
Yeah.
beyond the conscious want.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe is why, without knowing Cecilia, right, putting words into her mouth, like, she might be able to do that is because a baby is different. And even for
Yeah.
animals, right, like, that's one explanation. The other thing too is this person is obviously broken by the death of the baby she birthed.
Yeah.
And what seems like that they need, like, she needs it. And as somebody who has never given birth, has never been pregnant, I don't understand necessarily like what that would be like, but I can imagine, right, that it could feel like, we don't get depth into this, right? This is just like the first moment, that the first moment could feel like this can fix it.
Right. That reset button again.
It's like exactly that reset button, and they both kind of have that realization. They have to have it together. And I think if he had like presented it to her later or told her later, it likely wouldn't. But if she is there and in this, like, they can make that kind of like, oh, we need this to be that, and
Yeah.
you can't go any further, or else it'll not be the solution. I think there's a couple of different options there, but the ending is like,
Yeah. And I think I am going to read the last little bit. It's very sad, but I think it is I think it's worth reading, as just this is where the book leaves you. As he drags the body of the female to the barn to slaughter it, he says to Cecilia, his voice radiant, so pure it wounds, she had the human look of a domesticated animal. And that, like, I just like felt my chest just get tight reading that. Like, my eyes are like getting watery. It's really, he so rapidly regresses in his unpacking of this issue.
and I think for a book all about words, the key to me in this, as I love a good literary analysis, is she was Jasmine 2 seconds ago.
Mhm.
She was Jasmine. She's now the body of the female.
Right.
If we want to talk about the weight given to that word and what
Right.
it does in our society, again, in real world, like the female, what that carries, the connotations, who is given that, the female, right? And not in like the female girl boss sense, but in that like reactionary world we're seeing today, that the clamoring to what that word can mean and what it can do and the power that it has to depersonalize somebody.
Mhm. Right, and it's I mean, this is a conversation around sexism even, right? Is female as a noun
Yeah,
being dehumanizing, like, in a fundamental way.
not a female, not my, the female.
And not even the female body where female becomes the descriptor where it would make more some amount of sense, but the body of the female, right? The female.
To slaughter, not to kill, which is the part to me that I guess is why I went toward maybe he will, in my head, the full circle of I don't eat meat after baby is gone, I get baby back, I will eat meat now, even though we
Yeah.
don't see it. The slaughter to me versus killing her,
Yeah,
right? Like he kills her, but what they say, and again, the distance that we get in that language is that the book starts with, right? Is a not slaughter is a very constructed word.
totally.
The same with culling, the same with these agricultural terms, and like I think that again to be dismissive of like the power of this book because you don't think the plot is strong enough when like this entire sentence like says so much and it's the I mean I could turn this over in my head. I'm curious if you have thoughts, but like the human look of a domesticated animal also really interests me because it is it's anthropomorphizing, it's distinguishing between domesticated, wild, farm
Mhm.
raised, like this whole set, like there's so much, and it's like the author made sure that throughout the book you're paying attention to the words, and then you could read that and either be super disappointed or read this sentence and be like, this is the ending I need to take away with myself, is like pay attention to how quickly these words change and what they carry.
Totally. Yeah, and I think it's a very chewy sentence because it's about this person, right? It's about this world and then the human look of a domesticated animal and it's like this literally is a human. So there's that layer and then there's like the layer of how we do see humanity and anthropomorphize like typically more so with domesticated animals.
Who is afforded humanity?
Yeah, and it's interesting cuz we have this at the end and at the very beginning is where we have a quote where in his inner dialogue is he wishes he could say atrocity, inclemency, excess, sadism to Senor Aramia. He wishes these words could rip open the man's smiles, perforate the regulated silence, compress the air until it chokes both of them, but he remains silent and smiles. And we go from this really acute awareness to how disgusting this all is to the human look of a domesticated animal, and what a drop that is.
Yeah, especially too that he throughout the book says he was forced to slaughter, right? He had to slaughter them knowing this. He had to slaughter the pets, like but you had to slaughter. But this is nobody is making you slaughter this being. It's now his choice. I mean, it truly it wraps up. It's almost like the perfect ending, but only if you are choosing to pay. Like, and maybe this is the horror genre of it all. If you can overlook the fact of like what just happened and focus on the words and how quickly they changed.
Yeah.
It's very specific kind of nerds. These are the people who like loved 10th grade English lit or whatever and would like read
Yeah,
into like what color the sky was and like this
yeah,
is
yeah, but the book invites us to do that, I think, like, I think it's explicitly asking us to do that, and so I think I don't wanna be like, we're right to be doing that, but, like, we're kind of
oh, we're
right
right.
to be doing that.
I'm always right, so it's easy.
Fair enough, me too. But I think that we've spent a lot of the time talking about systems and language and all of these things, but there is one sentence from the beginning of the book that I think sinks in for me in a more tangible and, like, personal way. There's a moment where he thinks there are times when one has to bear the weight of the world, and I think that for me, that is maybe the biggest takeaway, at least that I can put into that's the biggest actionable takeaway, where similarly to what you've been saying, I can't save the animals that are subject to these things. And that shouldn't stop me from acting like I could and
Mm,
making those decisions and taking on the weight of those systems, not as a way to hurt myself or blame myself, but as a way to make different decisions. And I do think when we have the willingness and I think also the humility to, like he says, bear the weight of the world, we make different choices.
yeah, I can see why it hits so deeply. I feel like that's very much along the lines of being a killjoy, which is also what I identify as. Feminist literature sense of like, I am the person at the table who is going to be the different. I'm always going to be that person, right?
Mhm.
I'm not a minority in a lot of ways, and in some ways I am, and I make my existence makes people confront things, and it's
Yeah.
not against them. It just is how I function being the alt, how anybody functions when you're not the dominant, and you make people question the normative, and then like we said, the reaction is typically not support and excitement, right? You are in the few who tends to see, what I see without being me, and I feel like it's true. I also feel like I can't not feel the weight of the world, and maybe it's selfish, maybe it's how I am, but that is like in those decisions I also feel like I feel the weight of the world, which is why I make that conscious choice every day, right? I could easily stray, but I feel like I am one of those people that, feels the weight of the world. And much like, in Marcos and versus his sister, like my brother is very different. We were raised the same way. We're very different people. And
Mhm.
I almost am jealous at times that he doesn't seem to be a person who feels the weight of the world in the same way as I do, that makes it crushing, that makes me have to go through these things that are hard.
Yeah.
It is. It's hard. It can suck a lot of times, and I would choose it every time.
Yeah. I saw, this is like a little whatever, but I actually saw Wicked last night. I saw the play. I've seen the movie also 5 billion times because I love it. But I'm thinking of the scene where they are rescuing the little
Yeah.
lion cub and she's like, "Don't you think I know that it would be much easier if I didn't care so much?"
Yeah.
And I think like you and I are both the type of people who that resonates with, but then also have that sense of like, if everyone cared a little more, it wouldn't be quite so heavy. So I can't put it down.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean that book, that's a whole other genre about like what it makes you confront with the animals. But yeah,
Yeah.
it is. I to a point I do choose it because I could feel the weight of the world and not change my actions, but I think it's just who I am innately because I've been doing this from a very young age. I've been the odd one out in eating since from a young age, but in a way that like it doesn't bother me. It bothers me when it bothers other people, and that like I don't want to be inconvenient, but like I never waver in my stance. I evolve it, it grows with me, but I never am seeking a way out.
Yeah. Like you have, there are roots there, right? The plant kind of goes through its phases and like does different things over its lifespan, right? But your roots are pretty deep in this. And I don't know, I mean, I guess like for this is a good moment as any to just say like I really admire that about you and I really appreciate that you have been like willing to serve as a sounding board for some of my own like journey with this topic because it makes it easier, you know? I think you've given me ideas, you've given me things to think about and you've let me complain about foods that I've tried that didn't work and I just really admire all of this stuff about you and I think you are such a good example for me and for whoever.
That is so sweet. I'm not great at compliments, but it feels really amazing to hear it anyways, even if I'm gonna sit in the discomfort of somebody being just genuinely nice to me and reflect it back too. And I think we also share a mutual friend who I've had very similar conversations with, and they like very similarly call, I don't remember the term, like a non-vegan advocate.
I say vegan curious. That's what I say.
Yeah, I love that. But even I think loves is a little bit more active than like a non-vegan vegan. I should look it up. Anyways, like somebody who likes it, isn't that, but like believes in it and wants to lift it up or whatever. And I think there's a lot of people in any community, not vegan or not vegan, that don't care
Yeah.
or do care. And I think there's plenty of vegans who don't really care, which is fine, right? They don't have to. They don't necessarily feel the weight of the world. They have their own motivations. They're choosing it in different ways. We all have our exceptions. We all have our ways to make it workable for us. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that that too is like you said earlier, like we had more people who cared enough to try and act and to recognize that like anything is better than nothing, even if we're not right like rose-colored glasses, saying that like we are saving whatever. Like it's just I frequently say this. I believe that my veganism is selfish because when I take in this stuff, the only thing that keeps me going is that I am not directly doing that. It's very self-serving. My roots in it were not. I had no knowledge of the like. I didn't know a single other vegan. I had never read vegan literature. I didn't know the lifestyle aspects. Like it was just like I want to see if I can do this. It was an elimination diet. It wasn't great, but now I say that it is selfish in a way of like there's not a lot in the world that like helps me feel like I can move forward, and it's something where it does give me the pathway to move forward. I don't really care if you don't call me vegan, lowercase v, capital V, veganoid. Like the term doesn't bother me. It's I call it a practice,
Yeah.
and it doesn't have to be. Your practice doesn't have to look like mine. I'm not interested in policing what you eat. I'm not interested in policing other people's veganism.
Yeah.
I'm interested in finding a way to help me move through the world, and I think you're doing the same thing, right? And it's like whatever we can do. And there's a lot of things in the world that I don't do this with, but this is my grounding, like the best way I know how. And to let it change and to let it grow and to see it as mine and not something I'm doing to someone else or for someone else. It's ultimately how I can read this and go about my day. I don't know how I could go from this. Again, maybe that's why I'm born of it to cooking animals for dinner. Like I don't know how to make that shift, and a lot of people do, and maybe it's easier in some ways or harder in others. But I guess, curious for anybody who listens to this. Who else? I mean, I've loved hearing your perspective. I am curious, vegan or
Yeah.
not vegan, vegetarian, whatever. Like how you, if you change anything upon reading this, even if it's just a mindset shift or the words that you say. I'm curious what this
Mm-hmm.
evokes in people enough to act, or if it
Yeah.
does.
Yeah. I think I was already on board when I read this, truthfully. I do think that this would have been really impactful for me though. I mean, I think I was already kind of trying to make shifts and identify where to start because I think you got to start with things that feel the most sustainable, right? Like there's got to be some strategy there. But I do think that this book has a lot of potential to create that shift for people, which is why I think it's so good, even though it's so bad. um, and I think I would be really curious. And I can say, like for myself, I do still eat meat. I probably will not be eating meat today. After this conversation, I don't think I would be able to. And I do think that there is a simultaneous active distancing and active acknowledging when I do eat animal products. I think especially meat, but I think talking to you always is a good reminder of the interconnectedness of all of those systems, which I do really appreciate you kind of reminding me of. But I try to kind of take a moment and like mentally acknowledge what is happening. And then I think I have to also put it down because I have to eat. This is also why I am trying to see where I mean, I've said to you, I think people who know me know I have a lot of trouble with food. I don't really imagine I honestly hope this changes, but it's very hard for me to envision a life for myself where I am taking the right care of myself without animal products. But I am hopeful also that like that could change as I continue to make changes. And I think the biggest thing for me is thinking dialectically about it, not thinking black and white about it, and that it isn't like I have to be a capital V vegan or I can just not think about it. It's like I can figure out what I can do. I think also as we change, other change becomes possible. So I hope that, and I think that I will actually probably get closer to that than I picture myself getting. But I hold space for myself and that I don't have to do it perfectly for it to matter, both for myself and my own feelings, and for like, I think also like encouraging other people to think about it too. So I don't know.
The podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is, one of my favorite things to talk about horror is ultimately, what is it talking to me about? Like, what is it wanting me to think about behind all of the blood and guts here?
Again, I don't think it's super subtle, but apparently a lot of people who maybe aren't as engaged beforehand, right, who aren't at that place of you of questioning or me of being entrenched in it for a really long time, it's wild to me that you could read this and not even have that thought process going. But I know that that's how I'm also not telling people how they can need to survive, right?
Yeah.
That it's highly personal, and though this is a dystopia, it's really not that different from ours. And there's some stuff that like you're part of the system and you got to figure out the best way you know how to be in that system, or at least be honest with yourself and recognize like what it is that you do and you're responsible for, and figure out ways, maybe not going the direction of Marcos, but like the direction Marcos could have gone.
Thanks for listening to this episode of What Haunts You. And thanks again to Kayla for revisiting this very uncomfortable book for the sake of good conversation. Don't forget, you can find Kayla for more information on veganism and food systems on Instagram or Blue Sky at oiveitsk. And the link to her Substack will be in the show description. Next time on What Haunts You, we're going to keep moving through our Horror Through the Decades series. We're going to get into the horror films of the 1940s and 1950s and start exploring the impact of World War II on the films of the time. That episode will, of course, have some heavy content in it, but I think it's going to be a really interesting one. We're living in our own pretty crazy times right now, and like we talked about the book today, many of us do feel the weight of the world on our shoulders during times like this. But remember, it's a little lighter when we carry that weight together. So until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Have a good day.